Hey, welcome to our seminar. Good afternoon here in Sweden and good morning in Kansas, where our guest Darlene Bell is currently. We're very happy to have you here, Darlene. And before introducing you more fully, I'll first say something about the setting. So the forum, our seminar here. My name is Astrid Hedin. I'm a political scientist at Malmö University, and we're hosting the INSPA seminars this autumn. The INSPA seminars are seated at the Institute for Public Affairs at Lund University, which is headed by Louise Bringselius, who is also with us today. And Louise founded this INSPA Institute not long ago after having chaired the Swedish state delegation on trust in public administration for several years between 2016 and 20. And now some of the thinking that came out of that state investigation is now being further discussed among scholars within the context of INSPA. And since Louise, you're here, would you like to break in and just say a few words about what this webinar and seminar is, the series?
Thank you very much, Astrid. Yes, I would love to. Well, again, Institute for Public Affairs is a cross-disciplinary platform at Lund University, where we try to gather scholars across Sweden and work with aspects relating to politics and administration in the public sector. So this specific seminar, it's part of a theme we have focused on trust and administration and how we can relieve public servants from some of the administrative burden that they have. And as Astrid said, we do this in a wide collaboration, and where Malmö University and Astrid and Patrick Hall are some of those who share the trust theme and the webinars on that subject area. So thank you very much for hosting this, Astrid and Patrick.
Thank you, Louise. And now I can again and further welcome our guest, Darlene Bell. We're very, very happy to have you with us today. So Darlene Bell will speak on administrative burdens and trust. And in your work, it's the citizens who carry some of this administrative burden. So it's a slightly different angle. Darlene Bell is a public administration and law and society scholar in the School of Public Affairs and Administration at the University of Kanses. She is a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow and an Indigenous Education Cobell Scholar and a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. So we're very happy to have you here and hear about your work. Darlene and I met at the Public Administration Conference that was online, and now she comes to visit us through the web, and we're very happy with that. So please, without further ado, the floor is yours, Darlene.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I first just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here and to participate in this seminar. I very much like this idea of a creative studio and to discuss politics and research. I think that this is such an important space. And I think for me, it's a privilege and an opportunity to be in this venue in a university outside of the United States, because as we are a global society, it's so important to cross those boundaries. So just such a thrill and an honor to be here. I wish I was with you in person, but nonetheless, I'm here in the Midwest. But so as Astrid mentioned, my name is Darlene Bell. I am a third-year PhD student in the School of Public Affairs and Administration. My research generally right now has looked at nonprofit political mobilization and the nonprofit sector, but I have done work on welfare policies in the state of Kansas and came upon this extremely important research field of administrative burdens and trust. And so I do look at both the administrative perspective and the citizen or the service recipient perspective. So I've view of that interaction between the two. So that is sort of my unit of analysis. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen right now, and we will get started on my presentation here. All right, So first, what I'm going to do today in this seminar, first, I just want to talk a little bit about the data on trust in the United States and the government. And then second, I want to discuss some findings from some pretty leading scholars who study this interaction between the government and those who receive public services. And then third, I want to introduce this fantastic research and this language that Hurd and Moynihan have given us on administrative burdens and as it relates to trust and the government. And then I just want to briefly present some of my empirical work that I did on welfare policies that kind of capture this phenomena of what's going on with this burden trust relationship. And then last, I'll just indicate kind of the direction of my work now and where I see sort of the solution, at least from my perspective, on how do we how do public administration scholars and practitioners, how do we address this issue of trust in our public organizations? All right, so I will. I think I'll minimize this. All right, so here we've got some extremely important data on trust in the United States. This data is showing us that we've consistently seen decreased trust levels amongst Americans in our government institutions. We're at historic lows. So this data is running from 1960 all the way to 2020, and it shows the trust levels associated with each of our presidents here, and so you can see that, you know, we really are in kind of a state of general apathy towards our government, especially at the federal level. You know, many people really just, they no longer believe or think that the federal government can actually be a force for good in their lives. And there is widespread apathy. And I think what's notable also is that the share of trust, the share of the white population in the higher levels of trust than the minority population. And this is especially true among the Black and Hispanic subsets of our population in the United States. So trust levels do seem to correlate directly with minority representation. So what we have here, what I'm showing here is, you know, most Americans, they see that 75% of the people in this Pew Research Center study said that that trust in the United States and federal government is shrinking, and especially notable with each other. So we have just decreasing levels of trust across the board. But nonetheless, most of the people in this research are talking here about how important it is to have trust to solve problems. So this is a really important issue for public administration, as we are the institution that delivers public services. We have a really important role to play in sort of not only just understanding this issue, but creating some solutions to solve this issue of trust. So I have a couple of kind of just general, well, here, I just want to present this data here too. This is important. This is showing us that the data, that trust in state government is higher than trust for the federal government, and trust in local government is even higher still. So I think this is important because it kind of indicates that the closer a government structure is to the community and embedded within a community, the higher the trust is. And so this is why I've sort of decided to study the nonprofit sector as sort of these institutions where we see the most trust. And so, you know, the big question is, why do we have so much distrust in our government? And there's a couple pretty prevailing reasons why. Number one, unmet social needs, and particularly economic inequality and high rates of poverty. And so I'll just briefly touch on that here with this slide. But then the second big reason, which is that will be the rest of my presentation, is this negative interaction between government and those who receive public services. But I mean, we've all seen this pretty striking data here on economic inequality and the gap that continues to widen between those the top earners in the United States and the lowest earners in the United States. That trend is expected to continue, you know, and consistent and consistent with that also is wages. Wages and income have not tracked at the same rate as growth on wealth. And so I just want to mention here this Thomas Piketty's work, this critically important work. His book Capital in the 21st Century, he created this pretty simple and powerful equation of R is greater than G, which the rate of return on growth on income will always be greater than the rate of return on wages and income. So this trend towards economic inequality is expected to continue. And so that is one major reason why we have so much distrust in our government. And then I guess I'll just note, let me just go back to the slide right here. In my own research, I've done qualitative research with populations in the community and with administrators who are serving these low income populations, what they've communicated to me is that when these communities suffering the effects of intense poverty and lack of opportunity, constraints on opportunity, when they see other populations in society prosper, especially through government policies such as tax credits, zoning decisions, redistricting decisions, subsidies, incentives, and favorable policies skewed towards organized interest. When they see this fundamental difference, that alters the legitimacy that these populations give their governing authorities. And so there we have so much literature that speaks to this. I think Susan Mettler has done fantastic work on this in this area on how policies are creating these problematic perceptions of the government. So this skewed distribution of government's resources and economic inequality has really created a lot of mistrust, as I've said. So I think what I'd like to do here now is just discuss, just highlight some of these really important studies that we have on this interaction between frontline workers and the populations they serve. So we have this classic work from Lipsky on street level bureaucracy. Most public administration scholars are really familiar with this work, and because it's been foundational for our understanding that frontline public administrators are essentially policy makers, and their exercise of discretion and the choices that they make about policy implementation have extremely important implications for the substantive policies that gets implemented on the ground, and so they make interpretive decisions about how they want to administer policies, and in that moment of service delivery, and so that work has been foundational for our field, I think, as most of us know. And I remember when I first encountered that literature, I was just struck by this extremely important idea of policy. That government systems make policy, but it is administrators who actually implement those policies. And so then second, I want to mention really important work from Stephen Maynard Moody and Machino. This is some work on a book they wrote on cops, teachers, and counselors. And this was an extremely important work for our field, I think, just because well, first of all, it relies on storytelling and narratives and first-person accounts from frontline workers that has been important for our field, for methodologically important for our field. So Stephen Maynard Moody, I'm so fortunate he is in our department here at KU, at University of Kansas, and this idea that we can actually analyze policies through qualitative work, it has been a strong influence on the way I approach my research through more interpretive and qualitative methods. But nonetheless, I mean, also similar to Lipsky's work, their work found that frontline workers, they have to navigate their own belief system about the populations that they're serving, that also influences how they deliver their public services. And so this idea of implicit bias is sort of within that frame there on the perceptions that frontline administrators make about the people that they serve really drives a lot of how they deliver their public service. And then I also want to mention this work by my advisor, Chuck Epp, and also Stephen Maynard Moody and Hayder Markel. This is some really foundational work on police stops. And this is an excellent study on racial profiling. And I just want to mention the following quotes from their book, which is relevant to our discussion on trust and burdens. They state that psychological research shows that people, they care about procedural fairness because they view whether they are treated fairly as a measure of their standing in the community. And fair treatment implies that a person is viewed as a full and an equal member of the community who is deserving of respect. And unfair treatment implies, by a government entity, implies a lower status, that people who are mistreated at that government interaction feel that that the government feels like they are deserving of less respect. And so stigmatized groups, and these are the groups that kind of the core of my research, stigmatized groups are especially attentive to whether or not they're being treated fairly and with respect. And this is important as we in the United States have looked at historical patterns of inequality in how we have the government has interacted with minority populations, indigenous populations, Black and immigrant populations. So it's extremely important. All I will say here is I'm so very, very thankful that our program at KU, we have a lot of really foundational, excellent scholars who are working at this space of that interaction between the government and those who are served. And so then I'll just end here with this work from Joe Sauce and his colleagues on disciplining the poor. This study had a really strong influence on my work on welfare policies because really they make some pretty large claims about the central role of race in poverty governance, and in particular they were looking at welfare policies in their studies. They map how the welfare programs in the United States have been intentionally and with thought politically developed programs to discipline the poor and minority populations. They discuss the role of the state as this disciplining authority, very much driven by market logics and neoliberal logics, which we won't. That was kind of my focus when I did my welfare study. I won't get into that too much today, but really they also make this strong claim that these programs can serve as instruments of social control. So that was extremely important work and study that has made a strong influence on how we are especially looking at welfare policies in the United States. And so that brings us to this just all important work that Herdon Moynihan gave us a few years ago on administrative burdens, policy making by other means. And I won't belabor this too much because I think that this has made such an influence on our field on how we study these questions of trust. But the authors, they suggest here that any context in which the state regulates private behavior or structures how individuals seek public services, that is a venue where an administrative burden can be imposed. So that frontline interaction is always subject to an administrative burden that can materialize in that delivery of public service. They also, like others, have noted that these administrative burdens, they affect some groups significantly more than others. And that can reinforce inequalities and sort of create systematic patterns of disparity across across public service delivery programs. And they also, they go further to suggest here, and this is kind of going back to some of the work that Joe Sauce and his colleagues have looked at, that these burdens are not accidents, but they are deliberate, and they are designed generally to achieve a very specific policy or goal outcome. And that they can, they really can, these administrative burdens can serve as an ideological tool for political parties in the United States. And so this idea of policies achieving ideological goals was very much the case in my welfare policy study that I worked on here in the United States. And give me just 1 second here, sorry. Apologize for that, speaking quite a bit. Okay, so that brings me to sort of my my empirical work that I've done in this space. So the policy context for my project on welfare policies, at the time, excuse me, the state of Kansas had one of the most restrictive and sort of repressive welfare programs in the country. It's gotten a little bit better now. We have a new state level administration that is making some progress towards easing some of these burdens. Excuse me, but nonetheless, when I was doing my field work, the people who were participating in these programs were having extreme difficulty accessing government services. So many of the recipients were absolutely engaging with what we've come to know as administrative burdens. When I did this work, I wasn't fully steeped in this administrative burden literature. In my paper, I referred to this as procedural barriers, but that is essentially what I found in my study. So just as by way of context here, in 2011, our former governor made some major changes to welfare programs in our system, and in particular to our Tanf cash assistance program. So Tanf is temporary assistance for needy families. So what happened is that this Tanf program became extremely difficult to get and to keep and to regain if it was lost. The maximum amount of time that people could be on this program was reduced significantly. Surveillance and monitoring of the populations and investigations of the welfare recipient population was significantly increased. And policy supporters at the time, they suggested that these changes promoted a work ethic within the welfare population, and promoted self-sufficiency and personal responsibility. And that absolutely, we have discussions in the United States about, the deserving and the undeserving poor. And so some state legislators, they very much are driven by this idea that government assistance promotes sort of laziness, and that people will continue to sort of stay on government assistance and not find work. And so at this time, I was looking at the labor market conditions of the population and found that, for the welfare population, full-time work at minimum wage was still well below the poverty level. So the government assistance became sort of one of the only means by which some of these people could maintain sort of any sort of quality of life. So this data that you're looking at right here, it just shows that a dramatic decline of caseloads in this Tanf cash assistance program in our state. And you'll notice here around 2011, a sharp decline. So that was exactly when the policy, the welfare program was changed. And as a result, the administrative burdens became deeply embedded in the implementation of this program in the United States, and here in Kansas. So, so I'll just briefly discuss sort of my study. Here's an overview of how I conducted my research. And I wouldn't say this was a true ethnography because I wasn't in this area long enough to ethnography is this fantastic method that you to be embedded in an environment long enough to get to know all the variables of that research field. And ethnography is rarely used in our field of policy and public administration, but it nonetheless can be a pretty creative way to get at policy analysis. So I describe this work as an ethnography and an interview-based study. I had 4 weeks of a pretty intensive field work in an inner city area, and I did interviews with welfare recipients and administrators delivering public services in this area. So at the time I defined a recipient as anyone who had received any sort of government assistance, not just this particular Tanf cash assistance program. And most of the nonprofit, or excuse me, no, most of the public administrators that I did interviews with were nonprofit administrators, which is sort of one of the main reasons why I have studied nonprofits now is sort of my central place that I do my research. So I conducted my work in just a wide variety of settings, and I was really, it was just a fantastic opportunity to be in the community and to see how those policies were being delivered on the ground. I was in food kitchens and in churches, food distribution centers, in parking lots, in people's homes, and with nonprofit directors in their offices, but particularly in their places of service delivery with the people that they serve. So as I mentioned, I'm trying to maybe introduce some different methods in how I approach my work. And I've been so fortunate to be under the advisorship of one of my faculty members, Ben Merriman. He's a fabulous sociologist from the University of Chicago, who has really trained me in some of these more interpretive methods. And then Stephen Maynard Moody, as I mentioned earlier, fortunate to sit into a qualitative PhD seminar with him on using qualitative fieldwork in policy analysis. So I've been very, very privileged in my academic, my training so far with these fantastic scholars who've helped me in these interpretive sort of methods. But really what I wanted to do in this study was, as I mentioned before, is observe this interaction between those who receive government services and those who deliver public services. So I won't get into details too much here, but this is kind of a breakdown of my population that I did research with. I did a total of 48 interviews. Most of the service recipients that I did interviews with were Black or African American service recipients. Both among the service recipients and the nonprofit administrators that I interviewed, and so I guess maybe what I'll note here is that most of these nonprofits that I did work with were very small, and I wanted to be doing work in nonprofits that are embedded in communities and in close proximity to the poorest populations in our city. And I feel like I was able to achieve that with my research design. Nonetheless, this was one of my first studies out in the field, and as we look back now, I think I definitely could have designed this in a way a little bit more systematic, but it did yield some extremely important data that I'd like to cover now. So the major finding that I came to in this study was the application process to gain access to government assistance was extremely difficult. This is related to our discussion on trust and administrative burdens, because that application process was and continues to be a barrier for accessing public services. It's just a huge burden for the welfare population, and the application for cash assistance is it's 26 pages long. It's the same application for food stamps as well as for childcare assistance. This individual that I did an interview with, he indicated to me that, you know, on the application there are questions that are there that they are the same kind of question, but they're worded differently. And so when individuals are filling out this application, it's very confusing, and inconsistent answers on this application generally will mean that that application gets denied or rejected for assistance. And then, you know, if someone has a difficulty filling out that application, they will have to call the welfare office, and generally those calls always go to voicemail. During my work, I actually called the welfare office several times, never received a call back. And then if individuals have questions about this application process and they go to the office, generally there are extremely long wait times at the welfare office, up to 2 to 3 hours at a time. And so the application and the complexity of the application is so difficult for these individuals. And so I did want to gauge, you know, what is the efforts that are being put forward at the administrative level to help people access services through the application and help with the application. And generally, what I found is that the state level programs were not really offering a lot of assistance on how to fill out that application, but the nonprofit and the faith-based community, they were. And so I think that's notable. And it kind of speaks to nonprofits as being sort of a little bit more trusted, at least in the context of this particular policy. So a lot of people don't understand what's being asked. So I have a quote here from one of my interviewees, Martha. You know, she just indicated that the language is kind of it's very confusing. And so they to access these services, this population does need some assistance, or the application needs to be a little bit simpler or streamlined. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say on this slide right here. So kind of my second big finding on that research was that the welfare recipients are subject to pretty intense investigation and surveillance, which is consistent with some of my theoretical expectations that I defined going into that study. One of the welfare supervisors that I did an interview with, she's quoted right here. She basically said to me that one of the primary roles of a welfare caseworker is that of an investigator. And this is very consistent with what I mentioned earlier about this idea that the welfare population is on welfare because they don't want to work, or because they really are trying to defraud the welfare system. So in investigators, welfare caseworkers that investigate the welfare population, they when they uncover undisclosed income, that there's an incentive for that, because undisclosed income can raise the eligibility threshold that the welfare recipient has, and which causes people to have reduced benefits or get off of public assistance altogether. So this investigation of income is an extremely important arm of welfare programs in the state. So reduced welfare caseloads is consistent with some of our state level stated policy goals. And that gets back to the Heard Moynihan point about very specific policy outcomes get embedded in procedures that through these administrative burdens that produce effects and outcomes that some of the state legislators really wanted to see in our state. So so, but the biggest takeaway, I think, from my perspective in my research is that the recipients say that this investigation, this scrutiny feels demeaning, and that they feel that they're always being looked upon suspiciously, and a lot of people they just don't want to even deal with this kind of investigation. So this quote right here from one of my interviewees, she's just indicating here that, you know, to be on government assistance feels like that she's living in a box. And many people I spoke with said that they would rather just do without government assistance than to sort of subject themselves to this what feels like a very demeaning and dehumanizing process to access government assistance. Some of the interviews that I was able to do were pretty heartbreaking on what's happening at that interaction level between government providers and those who are seeking assistance. So some of the big implications, and this kind of, now I'm trying to bring it back here to kind of our main theme today, which is this issue of trust in the government and trust in public institutions. Welfare recipients, at least in my interview study, they have pretty deeply cynical attitudes and apathetic attitudes about the government and government officials, and really the government in general. These attitudes are influenced by that caseworker interaction and the welfare system, and also just their experiences in poverty and sort of noting that this the material conditions of what it's like to be poor in the United States. So during my interviews, I think what was notable is that I was pretty surprised how quickly conversations would shift from talking about accessing government services and talking about their caseworkers, welfare caseworkers, and how the interviewees would immediately start talking about the government pretty quickly. So I think that's noteworthy because you know, for the most part, this population, they don't believe that the government is going to do anything about poverty or you know, the kind of material degradation in their neighborhoods or in their communities. And I think several of the administrators that I spoke with said that sort of this deep distrust of government in that service interaction has led to a disengagement from the political process and lack of interest in civic engagement and voting and being involved in democracy. So these relationships with caseworkers, they have important consequences for how this population views the government, but how they act in society and the choices they make about civic engagement. And so what's also notable is that the welfare caseworker is generally one of the only government officials that this population has direct interaction with, face-to-face interaction with. And so there's just really fantastic research that talks about when there's a negative interaction with that caseworker, the population really does conflate that interaction with all interactions with the government and makes assumptions and presumptions about the government in general based on just these singular interactions. So that service delivery point is such a crucial, important place for how citizens are creating their perceptions of the government and institutions. So you know, I guess here just to and also I'll mention this quote right here. This is a quote from another welfare recipient that was kind of discussing what he thinks people in government think of people like him, and I won't read this out loud here, but the basic point here is that the poor and minority populations really have a strong sense that those in government, from the highest level of the president to the caseworker, really do look upon them with a lot of negativity and make presumptions of, they feel that the government is making presumptions about them as people, and kind of getting back to that work I talked about with respect. So sort of the implication here is that if our welfare programs are creating complexity as a procedural barrier and an administrative burden to discourage welfare participation, there's some real equity issues involved in that, because this is a vulnerable population because of their lack of education, lack of ability to sort of navigate the systems of government. You know, this is a population that's already struggling with the effects of poverty, and so if the government and government systems is intentionally embedding this complexity in the process of accessing government assistance, there's some real equity concerns in that we think about quite a bit here as public administration scholars, and so our program here at the University of Kansas, we are pretty well known for our focus on equity. So that is kind of always the lens by which I'm thinking about my policy questions. So I think sort of the general direction for the future of my research, I really am sort of situated on this question of this connection between the wealth, the way people receive government services, and what that means for people's interaction with civil society and civic engagement. So I'm still, as I mentioned before, I'm still a PhD student, a third-year PhD student. So I did not bring this study along to publication. Just I haven't had much time to do that yet. Maybe I will someday. Maybe design a little bit more rigorous study that was a little bit more representative of the population. But so I will mention some of these really fantastic studies that are out there on this on administrative burdens and trust and welfare and public assistance. So this work here is by Carolyn Barnes, and she discusses the burden of learning how to use public assistance and what that means for how people are navigating social welfare policies here in the United States. That is pretty recent work from that's really recent work. So that was referred to me by one of my advisors, a fantastic study. And then also this study right here is a hugely important work for me, because this was an ethnography on welfare policies in the state of Texas. And this, it was looking at the application process, which was of my particular interest. They really just found that in the study that mothers accessing government assistance found that when the social welfare programs went through the nonprofit sector, there was sort of less feelings of distrust and less feelings of being demeaned in their access to public services, and less surveillance. But nonetheless, also a really important study, because they also discussed this kind of a social phenomenon of other welfare recipients sort of being informants against other welfare recipients on reporting undisclosed income. So really interesting study in ethnography. I think a great example of an ethnography in public affairs that I think is needed and great. And then just this last work here by Spencer Hedworth. This is a really fascinating study on the welfare recipients' interaction with caseworkers and the use of deception by these welfare caseworkers to disclose to find undisclosed income in the welfare population. And this is a really fascinating work, because this use of deception by the administrator was intentional and purposeful, and it was meant to kind of exploit the trust that service recipients were developing with their caseworkers to find, for the sole purpose of finding undisclosed income. And so, I mean, nonetheless, when we have these sort of policy designs that are creating these systematic these negative interactions with the welfare population, then that data that we saw at the beginning, that distrust, especially among poor and minority populations, it begins to make a lot of sense. We have all of these fantastic studies, including some of my own field work that it sort of discusses this issue of trust. And so I'm not sure where we're at on time, but I will just discuss real briefly here that I guess I just want to say that the direction of my research right now, I've moved away a little bit from looking at this issue of welfare and administrative burden somewhat, because I discovered the nonprofit sector in this project on welfare, and that data that discussed the mistrust of the government, in that same data by that Pew Research data, they also found that people really do have hope that things can change. So that survey data indicated that most Americans do believe that that there can be a turnaround and a switch from the situation that we currently have with distrust of the government. But most people in that survey really did believe that the key place where trust could be formed was in local communities and in neighborhoods. So much more local focus on service delivery. And so this kind of the possibility that trust with the government could actually sort of reinstitute itself at the local level through maybe the nonprofit sector is where I'm kind of focused at right now. So this data that I've got right here on the right, this is showing that most people have a high degree of trust in the nonprofit sector, and the nonprofit sector is interesting because they are quasi government institutions. In the United States, they're largely tasked with delivering a large portion of the welfare state, and they are considered largely to be trusted community partners. And this is especially true when these nonprofits are engaged in more direct civic engagement activities. So when nonprofits are doing voter registrations or ballot issue education events in their in addition to delivering public services, they found that the trust of that nonprofit actually increases more when they're engaged in more civic engagement activities. So that is really the focus of my work now. This is pretty consistent with some of the research, this classic research we have from Putnam and social capital and sort of the efficacy that happens at the local level. So this is where I focus at now. And from my view, this is where sort of these trust relationships can be rebuilt from an administrative perspective, from a practitioner perspective. The nonprofit sector, I think, has a role to play in this space. And so also this, I'll just end here with this data here, that trust among nonprofits is increasing among people of color in the United States, as the sort of formal institutions of government are losing trust. The nonprofit sector seems to be gaining much more trust across this population. So yeah, so that is generally my work. And so I apologize, I'm not sure where I'm at on time, but I'll just stop sharing my screen now. And if you have any questions for clarification, I'd be happy to engage.
Thank you, Dee Arlene, for a fascinating presentation. And I know that these discussions there are parallel discussions in Europe and in Sweden that are sort of parallel but rather separate. And I think we will have a very rewarding Q&A session starting right now.